So how do you not gain weight over the winter? I usually empower my patients with knowledge. And the best knowledge I can give you is to explain how this hunger and satiety cycle works. And then maybe you can apply it to these feast days of wintertime. If you think about it, winter in Chicago is from Halloween until about Easter. That's when it gets cold. And unfortunately, most people, when it gets cold, most people stay indoors. I mean, I've adopted my activities to be mostly outdoors as far as hiking or snowshoeing or ice climbing or rock climbing. It doesn't matter, but I try to stay active no matter what. And I try to encourage my patients to do the same. The problem is if you're not adapted to the cold environment, then you're going to be indoors. If you're indoors, one thing that you'll find is you're going to be closer to the kitchen. You'll be closer to the fridge, you'll be closer to the kitchen table, you'll be closer to the cupboard where you keep all the packaged goods. So it might be very tempting. So you would figure that hunger hormones will stimulate you only a couple times a day. That's what's supposed to happen. In fact, I'll talk about that now. I've done a video on ghrelin. That's a hormone that comes from the stomach when the stomach acids are started to be secreted. That usually happens on a regular basis. It coincides with the rhythm of the day or the circadian rhythm. But usually 3 times a day you'll start to secrete acid and the stomach will secrete ghrelin. It's a hormone that circulates throughout the bloodstream till it reaches the brain, and when it hits the brain starts to hunt for food. Now that's pleasure seeking. There's a couple of motivational things that keep us as humans to survive. That's pleasure seeking in the form of food or sex, avoidance of pain, and then trying to find the least amount of effort to get the most for the day. Those things are the motivational triad, and if we stick to them, then we'll be fine. The problem is with the first one, pleasure and food, it's different today than it was before. If you were just doing the whole food, mostly whole food, plant-based dieting, it's not bad. But now we have all these candies and processed foods that are just so, they're very low in density, but they're high in calories, and usually useless calories. So they have to be really watched. But before I get to into that any further, again, going by that hormone called ghrelin, it usually peaks a couple times a day, and for some interesting reason, it peaks about 12 and midnight to 1 o'clock as well. And that might be the reason for hunting and eating at night, midnight snack. But regardless, when it peaks, the body sends the messages to the brain. The ghrelin in the brain makes you hunt, and then you hopefully will get some kind of energy source and eat it. Once it gets into the stomach, if it's healthy, it'll usually stretch. If it has high volume, it'll stretch the stomach, and those stretch receptors will shut off the ghrelin. And it'll shut off the stimulation to the brain, and the brain won't hunt anymore. The other thing that also shuts off the ghrelin are these density receptors. There are receptors within the stomach and pancreas that kind of tell how dense the food is that you're eating. So thus, when you're talking about high fiber foods, a lot of volume, and then you have to drink fluids, your stomach has a sense that these are really good value, high density, I don't need to secrete any more ghrelin. And the problem with eating a lot of fast food or processed food is you might get to the point where you stuff yourself with enough junk food that your stomach is stretched, and that might stop the ghrelin going to the brain. But then the caloric density is low, or I should say the nutritional density is low. Calories might be high, but the nutritional density is low in most of the crappy food, and then the stomach might or might not send or stop the ghrelin. So you have this schizophrenic type of activity going on in the stomach. So that might make it more difficult for the brain to stop eating. So that's the first thing in how I put a nod into good foods and push away bad foods or scold bad foods. So you should know about that. The other thing to also keep in mind is that there is another hormone secreted by the fat cells called leptin. And fat cells, just think of them like rechargeable batteries. When you plug a rechargeable battery in, you keep on waiting until the green light pops on, and when the green light pops on, charge is full. That's maximum capacity for that battery. Well, when you eat your energy source of the day, after getting the hunger hormone, your body hunts for food. It hunts for good food, hopefully, because it knows it's going to be rewarded. So when you get that food into the stomach, the small intestine is responsible for absorbing the broken down macronutrients. And once the body sends the energy to its vital organs to take care of all of the expenditures for the day, it reboots all the energy, all that extra, anything that's extra that's left over that you've eaten usually gets turned into fat and stored in fat cells, no matter what it is. Proteins, fats, or carbohydrates. If you have eaten to the point of your maximum where energy is equaled, or at least the energy spent for the day is refreshed, any extra energy you have on top of that is stored in fat. So amino acids get broken down into fats, carbohydrates get broken down into fats, and fats are fats. So that's where everything goes into the fat cells, and there are a limited amount of fat cells in everybody's body. So when these fat cells get stuffed, the green light goes on, that's leptin. Leptin gets secreted by adipocytes or fat cells, it gets to the brain, and the brain gets a secondary message, I am satiated, or I am full, stop eating. So you see you've got hunger hormones, ghrelin, that say, let's go, let's hunt, let's eat. And then stopping them stops the hunt and gives you satiety. You also have leptin from the fat cells that get secreted, has a green light to say maximum capacity has been reached, stop eating. So that's the satiety part. So hunger and satiety. And then there's the way insulin works, but I'll put the link that I did to insulin dumping and glycemic index foods, but for this lecture we're just going to talk about hunger and satiety. So that's in a nutshell what happens, and the ways to beat that now are, I'll explain in a second, but the ways to beat that are when you go through the typical 5 or 6 feast dinners of the winter season, if you wait until the last minute, like I mentioned earlier, and you don't eat breakfast, don't eat lunch, anticipating you're going to eat a lot for dinner, well, you're actually starving by the time you get to eat, and you won't be able to push away. The body will usually listen to when the ghrelin is stopped and when the leptin is started, and it'll stop. And it's going to stop. The brain will stop eating. The brain will tell the arms to stop feeding the mouth. But the problem is, if you got to starvation states, then it's going to be very hard to listen to those cues. The brain will say, I'm not listening to that ghrelin or leptin, I'm going to eat more because I have been in a famine and I want to store up because the next day might be famine too. So you'll eat past the point of satiety, and that's when it becomes painful. And you'll even still continue eating depending on the individual. So usually we have this set point or cutoff point, but and that's because the gut and the brain are talking to each other. But there's something called the hedonic hunger. And that hedonic hunger comes into play when you're satiated and you're full, say at a restaurant. You've eaten the appetizer, the entree, somebody else's entree because it was left over and they didn't finish theirs, and you're full. If you didn't listen to yourself, you didn't stop when you were 7/10 full, that's hari hachibu. You're supposed to stop when you're 7/10 full, and you wait about 15 to 20 minutes for the brain to get the message from the stomach, no more ghrelin, and also from the adipocytes, a lot of leptin. The brain will interpret that and give you satiety markers and make you feel happy. Well, if you don't listen to those markers and you keep on eating till you're full, and then on top of that, somebody wheels by the dessert tray and says, would you like any of these? So this is the hedonic hunger that comes into play. Your stomach, your digestive system from this point on, your digestive system knows I'm full, I'm in pain, I'm overstuffed. But the brain sees the dessert, the yummy stuff. It remembers what kind of pleasure it got from the last time it had chocolate or popcorn or anything with candy or soda. It remembers that and it wants it. It remembers the pleasure it had. Number two, if your brain thinks it's relatively cheap, when usually dessert's pretty cheap, then it'll say, let's go for it. Or if it's free, let's go for it. Number three, if it's right in front of you, it's going to be very hard to stop the hedonic hunger from starting up again. And that's where you go for the seconds and the thirds of the candy part. So that's why it's really important to stop when you're 7 to 8 tenths full, pull back from the table, maybe engage yourself in saying that this is it, I have to cut myself off. That's easier said than done. It's almost like an alcoholic going to a bar and saying, okay, I'm not going to drink. Well, if you're surrounded by people who are drinking, you're in a bar where people drink. If you are thinking about drinking, then the likelihood is one of these days you're going to drink. So these feast days, if you can kind of get ready for being exposed to this stuff and have it in the mind that you're going to stop at a certain point in time, then that will help. It'll help the hedonic hunger from taking over your eating frenzy. So that is something to keep in mind. It might get you prepared for not necessarily turning down everything the host has to offer you as far as dessert, but knowing when to stop. What I used to do when I stopped drinking, when I used to go to parties and hold a beer bottle around with me, and I guess nurse it. But I actually wouldn't drink it. I just hold it. That way nobody would ask me about another beer, if I wanted another beer, if I wanted another drink. The same thing with a plate. If you just hold your plate around, swish it around, maybe move the stuff around, you always have a plate, so nobody can fault you for not having a plate. You just have to hold it and not offend your host. Sometimes what I would do is go to the trash after nobody's watching, empty out the plate, and then put on dessert and just leave it there as my prop. But that's not all the time. That's just when I'm training and I don't want to be overstuffed the next day. I really can't. I don't like that pain. So another thing to keep in mind is that when I talk about macronutrients, proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, there are ways to use those three things to your advantage. Most of us have a small breakfast, a medium-sized lunch, and a huge dinner. And most of the protein comes at dinner time. And most of the carbohydrates come at breakfast and lunch. And it really should be the opposite way around. People who have seen my Reset Your Circadian Rhythm video, they know that I would rather, for deeper sleep, I'd rather have you eat a high carbohydrate meal at night because it brings on an insulin dump and makes you tired. I'd rather have you do protein dominant meals in the morning and in the afternoon to keep you awake because it avoids that insulin dumping hormone cycle, or at least the insulin causing you to get tired after an hour to 2 hours of eating. So the concept with a lot of the exercise physiologists that have done meta-analyses on using the three macronutrients have found that if you don't necessarily take more protein but divide up and spread your protein out throughout the day, you might be better off. So if you take the protein dominant meal at night and kind of take a little bit of protein, put it in for lunch, and take a lot of the protein and divvy it up for the breakfast. If you have a higher protein breakfast source, it'll keep you more satiated throughout either through lunch or at least in the morning. So protein dominant would be, and it doesn't have to be meat, it doesn't have to be seafood, poultry, beef or pork. It can be beans, it can be broccoli spears, it can be quinoa, or you can actually have a protein source. Although protein shakes and protein powders in fluids typically don't give you it might give you a sense of fullness if you make the shake frothy, but I did read a study where they looked at the effect of shakes on the individuals that used them for meal substitutes, and the shakes, even though they had high protein volume or high protein counts, the stomach still regarded that shake meal as a carbohydrate dominant meal. I'm not sure why that happened, but so I would rather have you eat the whole food approach at a protein dominant meal. So if you can, again, shift your protein, instead of doing it all at night, you spread it out, maybe more in the morning, definitely a little more in lunch, and then a little bit at night, and then make the nighttime more carbohydrate friendly. Healthy carbs, please, and fat friendly. Again, I know most people don't eat breakfast, don't eat a full breakfast, and I think some people, when I talk about fiber for lowering cholesterol, will say, well, I have a bowl of oat bran in the morning, and that's okay, but it doesn't have that many grams of fiber, which is usually, I think Fiber One says that they have 10 grams of fiber in them for 2/3 of a cup. but your average bowl has about 4 grams of fiber, and we all need at least 25 to 30 for women and 35 to 40 for men. That's what I usually shoot for. And if you can't get that to lower the cholesterol, lower your postprandial sugar levels, then you might want to add fiber in the form of psyllium. This is cheap, you know, Metamucil, psyllium. I just don't like Metamucil because it has aspartame and yellow dye number 5 in it, so I go with Organic India. And I put 3 teaspoons of this in 8 ounces of water. I take that, people who see me in the morning in my clinic, they usually will, the first couple of patients usually see me carrying around this stuff, and it's psyllium. But that's my fiber. I don't have a problem with cholesterol or sugar, but I'm just trying to be healthy. And anyway, it also, so this is a great bulk stimulator. If you chase this with fluid, and I usually have 5 cups of tea in the morning, it'll usually give the stretch receptor to the stomach, and it's a sense of the stretch, and it'll tell the brain, I'm happy. So again, you get satiety with that. You also get health benefits with fiber. So if you also get health benefits with protein. Protein, 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 protein. So I'm not saying just be dominant protein, but if you kind of use the macronutrients to your advantage, if you use good planning because you understand now how satiety works and how hunger works and satiety works, then you might be able to plan for the feast you're going to. I wouldn't necessarily starve myself before the feast. I would usually eat something small before the feast. Go in, I mean, I wouldn't have a big meal, but go in so that you're not starving. That way you can wait, take your time, enjoy company, eat slowly. And then again, I try to keep the activity up. If you kind of understand the way your hunger starts, the way your satiety works, and you push yourself away when you're about 7 to 8 tenths full, just give yourself about 15 minutes, you'll be better off, and you might be able to truly get those cues that tell you you're satiated, you don't have to go any further.